Vanakkam. Today we are going to meet Mr. Vetri Subramanian, who is head of equities in UTI Mutual Fund. And UTI Mutual Fund manages more than 1,55,000 crores worth of assets under management, out of which, if I'm right, it's about 80,000 crore plus equity assets, which is headed by Vetri. And Vetri Subramanian is a Chennai person, and he has done his undergraduate in Chennai, if I'm right. Probably I will ask him a little more about it when we start the interview. And subsequent to his BCom in undergraduate, he has done IIM Bangalore, MBA or postgraduate diploma in management, whatever you call. So for the past 3 years, he is associated with UTI. And prior to that, he was with Invesco Mutual Fund, Kotak Mutual Fund, Motilal Oswal Securities, SSKI Securities, etc. So now let us directly talk to him. And Vetri, good morning, and thanks for accepting our invitation to our subscribers and sharing your knowledge. And just to before getting into the subject, as I understand, you grew up in Chennai, if I'm right. Where did you grow up, and which college did you go to in Chennai?
Yeah, good morning, Chokalingam. Happy to be here on this call today. It's been a while since we met, and of course, because of this pandemic, it has become very difficult to meet anybody in person. So everything has to happen virtually. But in a way, it's also an advantage because, through this medium, not only the two of us can have a conversation, but the same conversation becomes available to so many more of your subscribers. So happy to do it. You're absolutely right. I am a Tamilian with a name like Vetri Murugan Subramaniam. It's almost a giveaway that it is certainly a Tamilian that I am. I actually spent a lot of my initial years all over the country, not in Chennai or in Tamil Nadu. So, I was born in Mangalore, and then because my father was in a very transferable job, I had different work sites all over the country. So I actually came to Chennai only when I was about 8 years old. And as a result of that, that how much Tamil can I speak? Actually, the reality is that my Tamil is very poor. When I came to Chennai in 1978, I only knew 2 words in Tamil, Amma and Appa, because I had grown up in, Gujarat, in Karnataka, in Panipat. So my Tamil knowledge was very, very restricted. So only when I came in 78 to Chennai, I actually started to learn Tamil, because at that point of time, Tamil Theriyadana, it's very difficult to manage in Chennai. Today, of course, I see a lot more other languages being heard in Chennai. But I came only in 1978 when I was 8 years old. And most of my education happened in Madras Christian College School. From my 6th standard to 12th standard, I was in MCC. And then afterwards, I did my BCom from Loyola College. So one was in Chetpat, the other was Nungambakam, almost just 1 kilometer apart. But I have lovely memories of being at both those institutions. Fantastic institutions and still great colleges to go to.
Generally, people expected, because of US elections during November this month and October, November, that markets will go down, and everyone was expecting that. That is the market sentiment or talk, TV talks, paper, everything. So, if Democrat comes or whatever it is. So finally, they expected market to go down, but unexpectedly, market is going up and up and reaching all-time high. So now where are we looking at? Is it still a good time, or these good times are going to continue? The Nifty PE is approximately 35 plus, price to book 3.66, whatever. So all those things. So these values, now people are expecting again a correction. They are saying, investors, I mean, another 10% might come down. So I'm waiting. So generally, I want to pick your thoughts, how to approach for the investors and where are we and what is the market overall, like a market scenario kind of thing, snapshot.
Sure. Yeah, so let's try and address that in two parts. First, let's talk about this thing of expectations about what will happen in the election. See, in my career, and I've been in the market actively from 1994, is what I would say. I have seen this belief about people having some idea about what the market will do during an election several times, both in India as well as in US. And every time the market eventually ends up surprising you one way or the other. But for some reason, people believe that they have crystal clear ability to forecast these things. I realized many years ago, particularly after the, if you remember the 1996 election, when the government led by Narasimha Rao lost, and there was a united front government, and everything that we heard, we were told it's a coalition government, it will be so unstable, market is finished. And then surprisingly, they delivered some unexpected reforms in the budget, and before we knew it, the market had gone up dramatically. So I took a decision many years ago that it is best not to take investment decisions based on what will happen in an election, because first of all, you don't know what will happen in the election. Secondly, even if you know what will happen in the election, you don't know how the market will eventually react to it. So given that both are uncertain, it is best not to take decisions on that basis. So, I never expect either market to come down or go up because of an election, and we never try to judge what it might do. And that is the strategy I would recommend to everybody. Just to give you a simple point over here, my portfolio turnover ratio, I'm talking about the fund that I manage directly, which is Value Opportunities Fund. 1 year ago, the portfolio turnover ratio was 30%. Today, it is 25%. We had an India election, we had a US election, we had COVID. My portfolio turnover has stayed in 25 to 30%. What that tells you is that when you think long term and you prepare for things that can go wrong, then you don't have to react to that and keep trying to change things. So that is one part of what you asked. Second part, which is valuations. Now, this is obviously a far more challenging issue today, without doubt. I normally tend to look at two metrics. Where is the trailing PE multiple? Where is the price to book multiple? And secondly, how do equities compare relative to bonds? Now, the trailing PE multiple actually became nonsense because of the lockdown. Because companies had to shut down, you were not getting any earnings. So trailing PE multiple at this point of time, we had stopped looking at. Main indicator we were looking at was price to book. Because of the sharp rally which has happened, particularly in this early part of November, I think as of today when we speak, it's up more than 10% in November itself. The price to book multiple for the first time has actually gone out of the fair value zone and just entered what we could call the expensive zone. The PE multiple, I am not looking at too closely for the reasons that I said. When you look at the earnings which are impacted by a lockdown, which is most probably a once in 100-year event, then the PE multiple will not give you the right indicator. But the price to book is also telling you that today, for the first time, equities have become slightly expensive, not comparable to previous peaks, but slightly expensive. When you compare bond yields to equities, again, you are looking at an earnings related metric. It is still slightly in, so I would say, sort of neutral territory. So net, my approach towards equities is that whatever is your asset allocation plan, continue with that. This is not the valuation at which you would try to raise your equity allocation. The time for raising equity allocation happens only when valuations are very cheap, right? That was cheap in March, it was cheap in April. Frankly, even I would say till September, you were still in fair value and you could have made an argument to increase allocation to equity. Today, there is no reason to raise allocation to equity, but I would say still have some medium-term plan. whether it is a SIP or whether it is through some systematic transfers over a 6-month, 12-month period, have a plan and allocate on that basis. Don't try to take an aggressive decision today. The valuations don't give you the, are not favorable for taking that decision.
Okay. Stick to the asset allocation. That's what you are saying right now, and
Yeah.
slightly in the expensive zone. So
yeah.
that having said that, say like if in the next 3 years or 5 years, do you expect any big bull rally kind of thing? Index doubling from here. Do you see any kind of signs for that?
Yes, this is almost like $1 million question, and this question cannot be answered. I have spent, as I said, now almost 6 years in the market. In 26 years, I have never been able to answer this question as to will it double in the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It happens when you don't expect it. But it also happens when markets are very, very cheap, right? Maybe 3 years from now, when you look at the bottom which happened in March, you may find that the markets have surprised you in terms of the returns. But from today's level, I think that would be a challenge. Let me make one more point over here. We have just got the results for the September quarter. The results were much better than expected. In fact, for the first time after the earnings season got over, actually the consensus numbers started to go up. This has not happened for some time. Typically, earnings come and everybody ends up cutting the earnings. So I think clearly the rebound in the economy has surprised. The extent to which companies have benefited from lower cost and less competition has also surprised. And that is why earnings have come in positive. FY22 should be a very strong year for earnings growth. But to really see the market do whatever, if you want to call it a bull market, though I don't like to use that label, you need two things. You need valuation support and you need earnings growth. At this point of time, we are not yet sure that we are at the start of a multi-year earnings cycle. The historical trend of earnings growth for many years, I would say the last decade in India, has been closer to single digit. Unlike the period 2002-2010, where the CAGR was, a high double digit, it was almost 17-18% CAGR. It is not clear that we have entered that kind of a period right now.
Okay, it is not yet clear. That's what you are saying. And say like overall economy, the macro economy of India, how is it doing generally? I mean, earlier you partly answered the question. Say like we are coming out of a big pandemic, etc., etc. But in general, some economic parameters you might be, going through, overseeing to understand how the economy is doing, because there is people in general, public are not able to understand. They see that economy is not doing well and there is the issues, etc. But stock market is going up. So generally, how is the Indian economy from your point of view?
So, first things first, you have to remember that even though the economic data for the March quarter and for the June quarter in particular was very, very weak, and technically we will have maybe 2 quarters of GDP decline, which equals a recession. This is not a business cycle recession. Business cycle recessions, that is the kind of dramatic slowdown that we see in demand, which happened during the global financial crisis. It happened during the Asian crisis all the way back in 96, 97. And of course, we also saw a little bit of the policy paralysis led slowdown in the economy, though not a recession, sometime in about 2012, 2013. That was a compression of demand, which led to a slowdown in the economy. Did the economy slow down in the March quarter and June quarter? Of course it did. But it did not slow down because of an economic cycle. Governments put the economy into a lockdown. They told consumers, don't go out of your house. And effectively, people could not even go out and produce, right? So there is a difference between an economic cycle and a technical recession caused by a pandemic. That is point number one. So the two are not comparable. of course, reported GDP growth will look terrible, but one is because of poor economic cycle, which is very different. This is because of a pandemic. This is a completely different creature. Second point that I think we have to look at in this context when we are looking at growth is that yes, across a host of metrics, whether you see GST collections, you look at the e-way bill generation, you look at power generation, you look at the retail sales which are happening for two-wheelers and four-wheelers. Many of these numbers have actually been very, very strong. You look at some of the agriculture sector related metrics, whether it is fertilizer sales, whether it is tractor sales, these are actually very strongly positive year on year. So what can we interpret from all of this? Two things. One, we put the economy into a lockdown. The economy has surprised us by coming back to normalcy far sooner than any of us may have anticipated or expected. B, does that mean the whole economy is doing fabulously? Obviously, the answer is no. And I'll tell you why the answer is no. The stock market and listed companies essentially reflect the fortunes of large formal sector businesses. Are we saying that the informal sector, unorganized sector is doing as well? They will get benefit from the strength in the formal sector, but clearly some of those businesses continue to face challenges. Second issue, just like agriculture in the rural areas has actually done well, there is enough anecdotal data to suggest that in urban areas, the sort of service economy has suffered, right? Related to travel, related to tourism, related to just going out, eating, entertainment, all those activities have been very, very weak. So we are in an economy where one set of companies have benefited, another set of businesses and individuals are suffering. So it is not a complete recovery to where we were in January of 2020, but the corporate sector has made a very, very significant recovery because it is organized, because it has access to money, it has access to capital. The supply was shut down. When they reopened the economy, these companies were able to restart their businesses much faster. They were able to control costs, and you have seen profitability. So I would just say the economy has surprised us by the recovery. The stock market is doing well because it reflects the fortune of organized sector companies. And these organized sector companies are gaining market share from the unorganized sector. They are also making higher margins because costs have come down or some of their competitors have vanished from the market. So it is certainly an uneven recovery, but once you get the corporate sector recovery going, the momentum will gradually translate to the rest of the economy as well, except for some of those troubled areas, urban services, travel, tourism, entertainment. There, I think the recovery time will be much
longer. Okay. So you mean to say it's the percolation will take some time?
Yes.
Okay. Understood. Coming to one of your funds, UTI Equity Fund, and UTI Value Opportunities that you manage is also doing well. UTI Equity is also doing well. Across, things are picking up. So now this UTI Equity Fund, if I'm right, it is a multi-cap fund right now. Many of your peers are planning to convert their multi-cap funds to flexi-cap funds because of the 25% small cap, 25% mid cap, etc. So do you have also plans to convert UTI Equity Fund to a flexi cap fund?
Without doubt, if you see the way we manage that strategy, typically it has always had about 60-65% in large caps, and the mid and small cap allocation has been anywhere between 30 to 40%. And that is the style with which we have managed the fund for many years. So our first priority is to make sure that the fund manager can run the strategy exactly the way investors expect him to. That will be possible only by migrating the fund to the flexi cap category. We have already communicated to many of our partners that we have initiated the process of conversion of the fund from the current multi-cap category to the new category of flexi cap. Of course, as you are aware, it requires trustee approval, it requires the regulatory approval, but that process has already commenced, and we hope over the next month to 2 months we can, sort of complete the process.
Okay, so in that way, the investors can remain, guaranteed kind of
Yes,
thing.
yes, yes.
The strategy will continue to follow. They need not worry about it. And
100%. The process of conversion has already commenced.
Commenced. Okay, done. That is a good news. And about the process that you follow in UTI, I think when you took over this equity part in UTI, you made some changes, etc., which I am aware. But the thing is, very briefly, if you can tell the viewers, the process that you follow in stock selection or portfolio building, whatever you want to call it. So that very briefly, if you can tell what are the major parameters that you look for, how you select, etc.
Good question. So, we have the benefit of having a large research team, 8 analysts supported by 3 junior analysts, and the team put together now covers almost about 320 companies officially, and including about 15 to 20 companies which are on sort of unofficial coverage, which are likely to be brought into coverage. So we have a wide coverage. Now,
can you come again?
I think
sorry, how many? I was not able to hear. How many analysts?
So 8 analysts with the head of research, and then 3 junior analysts who support them in carrying out putting together the models, maintaining the data, and gradually they can also graduate into full-time analysts. So it's about almost 11 members involved in full-time research, and they cover, as I said, about 320 companies which are on the official coverage list. And then about 15 to 20 companies we are ready, as and when they decide or the fund managers decide, it can be brought into coverage. So that is the universe that we cover. Now, I would say the UTI investment process fundamentally rests on 2 pillars. And these 2 pillars are what we believe eventually creates wealth in any company. The first pillar is, does the company generate operating cash flow? Now, normally when you see the stock market or you see any conversation, everybody focuses on how much profit does the company make. But I think what we have learned as investors over a long time is that profit is a function of certain accounting interpretations and certain accounting principles. But profit is not equal to cash that the company has actually earned during the year. So when we say operating cash flow, we are actually saying that, of course, profits are important, but we as investors need to be aware what is the actual operating cash flow that the company is generating. Now you will say, why is operating cash flow important? Operating cash flow is important because if the company does not generate cash and only has accounting profits, then even to run your business on a day-to-day basis, you will have to borrow from banks or from your shareholders. Point number 2, unless you have operating cash flow, you will not be able to reinvest in your business and be able to grow the business over time, right? So this is why we believe that operating cash flow is the fundamental pillar that in any company which has created value over time, you will see that it has a good track record of converting profits into cash. Now, we go to the second pillar. Second pillar is, how does a company grow? A company grows by reinvesting in its business. Now, it can borrow money from banks, or it can borrow money from shareholders by raising capital. Or if you generate cash flow, you don't have to take the money from anybody. You reinvest that cash flow in your business, right? When you reinvest that money in your business, there is one golden rule. The return on the capital that you earn has to be higher than the cost of capital. If the return on capital is lower than the cost of capital, you are destroying money. You are not creating any value. So these are the 2 fundamental and very simple pillars that underpin the investment process at UTI. Does the company create cash flow? Is the company investing the cash flow at a return on capital which is higher than cost of capital, right? So these are the 2 parameters that the analysts really focus on. What we have also done, Chockalingam, is we have an internal framework. We look at the previous 5-year records of all companies, based on which we would categorize them. So company can get rated as C1, which means previous 5 years every year it had a positive cash flow. C2, it's less regular. C3, very irregular. Similarly, companies get rated based on return on capital. R1, last 5-year return on capital is higher than 18%. R2, lower. R3, very low. Right? What this gives us then is a very clear framework as to what kind of company it is, what kind of metrics does it have, and then as an analyst, the focus is very simple. If the company is low in terms of return on capital, do we have an argument as to how it can improve the return on capital over the next 3 years, 5-year period? If it can improve, then it provides us an argument to invest in the company. For many other companies, their cash flow profile, their return on capital is already very, very strong. In that case, we just have to remain invested in them with some degree of confidence and regular review, because as long as they keep generating that high return on capital, we know that it will convert into wealth for us. So these are the two pillars which sit at the heart of the research process at UTI. All companies get these very objective ratings. The analyst perception is very simple. Can this company improve or can this company sustain? In both cases, we get good investment ideas. If you think the company will deteriorate or the company cannot improve, then it is not a good investment idea. So the advantage of having a process actually is not so much that it will help you identify 10 baggers and 100 baggers. It will help you avoid accidents.
True.
The minute you avoid accidents, automatically the probability that the investments you make will end up becoming successful have gone up. And that is why we think this investment process is key to the success that we have had, in recent years.
Very good, Vetri. Thanks for putting that in a nice framework. Now, as an addition to that, say like now there is a lot of talks about active versus passive funds, and I think you do manage passive funds also. If I'm right, around 20,000 crore plus something passive funds also you are managing for NPS and other things, or PF, I don't know. So now coming to that point, say like now you are putting so much hard work with so many analysts, so many fund managers, and picking the right stocks, etc. Now, where do you see active versus passive investing in India? Say like in other countries like US, passive funds have become much larger than active funds, if I'm right. So where do you see in India investors should go with, because mostly India is driven by active funds right now, and people are willing to invest in active funds because of the alpha that it gives. But what is your take on that active versus passive thing, that discussion?
Correct. So my attitude towards this is that whenever anybody says, how should I stay fit, correct, it's very simple. You need to be careful about what you eat. You also need to be careful about the exercise that you do. Both are important. If you say no, it's only about what you eat, incorrect. If you say no, it is only about how you exercise, that is also incorrect. Both are required. I think similarly, this is a very theoretical debate about active versus passive. In my opinion, there is room for both to coexist in the market. There is scope for both products to come into an investor's portfolio. It is a question of what is right for them and what is the opportunity set that they have. So our approach at UTI has been that, look, we are a manufacturer. We have put a solid team behind active management. We have a process, we have talented people, we have experienced people. They will continue the pursuit of alpha, which we believe our process will give us an advantage such that we will be able to deliver the alpha. Some people might say, I don't want the alpha. I am just happy if I can get some return from the market at the least possible price, where I know that my fluctuation will always be in line with the market. So for those people, there is a passive product. My own view is that over time, just like you have seen in the US, you will see some increasing demand for passive come in. It is likely to come initially from the institutional investor, where they are also concerned about the fact that they don't want to have adverse selection of products. B, they want to be able to say that whatever our equity allocation is, we got the benchmark return. And passive only promises you that. It cannot do better, it cannot do worse. But for some people, that is a good option. They don't want the extra. They just don't want to have worse. So I think for many institutional investors, and that is where we are seeing this PF money start to come in quite aggressively into equities, I think a lot of that will go to passive. And even for some individual investors who say, I don't want to waste any time, or I don't want to spend my energy trying to figure out which fund, how to allocate and all of that, you will find that some of them will choose passive. Will passive become as large a portion of our industry as it is in the US? Maybe not in the next 2 to 3 years, but I certainly think there is room for passive in all investors' portfolio.
Okay. That is good. And the other thing in the industry is say like growth versus value. So some people are stuck with value, like it could be like PSU stocks or many of those items. Some people chase even within the fund management industry. Some of them chase growth stocks which say like even in some of your portfolio, when I see the PE range or whatever, so that range is like anywhere between up to 140, 240. Some stocks I'm seeing PE of 240, 35, 50, 80 and all, etc. So that I presume to be growth stocks. And whichever comes like PE at 8, 10, 6, I presume to be value stock. So I may be right or wrong, but the thing is, which one are you focusing in as a fund house in UTI? You are more inclined towards, because even in your value fund, I am seeing more of high PE stocks. So, in which category you want to put yourself, or you have a different approach to that?
So first of all, I should say that at UTI, I think what I take great pride in is that we have a very talented set of fund managers. And that talented set of fund managers actually have a diversity of approaches. So somebody like Ajay Tyagi, who manages the UTI equity fund, very clearly he is a bottom-up, growth-oriented, quality-oriented investment style. If you look at something like value opportunities, which I manage, I would say it is more blended, but the focus is more on intrinsic value. And then you could get, let's say, something like core equity, which is also on our shelf, which is run with a more traditional approach towards value, which is more metric driven. So I think as a platform, we would like to support all approaches. We don't have a view that only one approach or the other approach is the right approach. But certainly we believe that if you follow any approach in a very disciplined way, there will be periods where it works, there will be periods where it does not work. But over time, because your good periods are more than your weak periods, you will be able to create the alpha. So that is point number one. We don't have a single approach, we have a diversity of styles, but each of those styles has to stay true to mandate. Suddenly the equity fund cannot decide that I will start doing deep value and cheap stock investing. It is meant to be a certain kind of fund. It will always stay in that category. So that is point number one. Second, I would say, unfortunately, too much of value has just come to mean cheap PE multiple. And I think that is actually a very flawed thought process. Because I think what people are forgetting when they look at only cheap PE multiple is that they are forgetting the risks associated with the business. As I told you earlier, to be able to create value for the company as a business, there are two fundamental metrics. Are you generating operating cash flow? Are you investing that cash flow on a return at a rate of return which is higher than the cost of capital? Now, when you look at that second argument, there is another caveat there. For how many years can you do that? Is your opportunity for growth 1 year or is it 3 years? I think one of the challenges that we see in the market today, when you look at some of the sectors and some of these companies, we would argue these businesses don't have terminal value, right? What is the terminal value of a company which is in the coal business? The environmental pressure on that company is already that you have to reduce your coal production. Government of India is a signatory to a treaty which says we will continuously reduce the production and the share of coal in our energy basket. The chairman of the largest government-owned power company says, I very proudly that I don't plan to build any coal-based new power plants in the next few years. So what is the future of such a company? Are you really investing capital at a rate of return which is higher than your cost of capital? Well, let's take another example. There are so many companies today which produce equipment and things which go into running petrol and diesel based automobiles. If the whole world shifts to electric based automobiles over the next 5, 10, 15 years, there is no opportunity left for companies who operate in that space. So I think the problem with people who look at cheap PE multiples as value is that they are forgetting this basic element. Can the company generate operating cash flows? Yes. Can it reinvest that capital at a rate of return which is higher than cost of capital? Maybe today the answer is yes, but can it do it for 2 years? Can it do it for 3 years? Can it do it for 10 years? Can it do it for 20 years? Unfortunately, over there, the answer becomes no. And when it becomes no, it will have an impact on your valuation. So to simplify this, eventually, I would say, even in the fund that I run, which is value opportunities, our approach is intrinsic value, not cheap PE multiple. Because we understand that eventually value is created by a company which can invest at a return on capital which is higher than cost of capital. And therefore, an intrinsic value approach is more suited to investing rather than this approach of only looking at cheap PE multiples. However, we are very clear that even in our value opportunities fund, we have a universe of stocks in which we can invest, and then there is our benchmark. You will always find in the value opportunities fund that the PE of the portfolio is less than the benchmark. The price to book ratio of the portfolio is always less than the benchmark, and the return on equity of the portfolio is less than the benchmark, because we are always investing some part of our portfolio in companies where we are looking for an improvement in metrics going ahead. We are looking for those cyclical improvements. Right? So you can't reach that decision based on just one stock, but in aggregate, when we look at the portfolio, you will find always PE, price to book, ROE lower than benchmark. And to give you the counter example to that, if you look at UTI equity fund, which as I said is completely bottom up, growth oriented, quality oriented, PE, price to book, ROE, same benchmark, it is always higher, right? So that is how I think we as an organization have very clear objective frameworks for how we will manage the portfolios and how we will ensure that we are always running them through to mandate. So if you ever see my value opportunities fund price to book, ROE, PE ratio going above benchmark, then you can ask me that, Vetri, what are you doing? It doesn't look like a value portfolio. But I think as long as I keep it below, then I'm in my territory as a value manager.
Good. Agreed. So you are, you are present in both things, and it is up to the investor to choose which is right for them. But one good point that you told is whenever you go with a strategy, remain with it.
Okay. So yeah, and not only remain with it. If you actually look at our website, you look at our fact sheet, we actually publish a detailed sheet called a Ready Reckoner. And the Ready Reckoner is literally like a health report of the portfolio on these parameters, plus some more parameters. For example, we talked about R1 rated companies. If you look at Ajay's equity fund, which is a growth oriented strategy, 95 to 96% of the companies in his portfolio are R1 rated. If you look at value opportunities, it's typically only about 55%. It's not 95%. So we have almost about 10 parameters that we look at to understand whether fund managers are managing the portfolio as per the mandate. And that is where I think investment process becomes very, very important. And as I said, it would be lovely to have a fund which performs in all seasons. But we have to recognize that sometimes the market has moods. And when the market has a particular mood, a particular strategy may not do very well. But if you stay invested in the strategy over time, it continuously is able to generate alpha for you. I think my experience in the last 4 years at UTI, as well as my previous firm prior to that for 9 years, is that when you consistently run with discipline, over time, all your strategies can create alpha.
Good. And coming to the point that, generally for a normal novice investor, from the markets, if he keeps investing for the next 5 to 10 years, or he puts bulk now, whatever it is. So many of them are doing SIPs. Now with the bank deposit rates at 5%, approximately, and savings bank rates 2.7% with the State Bank of India. So what is a reasonable expectation, a number? I want a number. What is a reasonable expectation investors can expect from equity mutual funds if they stay invested for the next 5 to 10 years?
No, so that's a fantastic question. Let's just put it in context. And the context that I use for this is, where is inflation in the country? Inflation is measured by CPI. Of course, the latest prints have been slightly elevated, but I'm basically working with what is now the MPC framework. MPC framework is that they want CPI inflation of 4% plus or minus 2%, right? Let's say once these supply disruptions go away, previously for the past 3 years, we were successful in that plus 4 plus or minus 2 years. Remember that, right? So let's say that is the targeted CPI rate. If that is the targeted CPI rate, bonds, government bonds may give you 150 to 200 basis points higher than that 4%. So let's say 6%. On top of that, equities, because they are more risky, because they are more volatile, volatility is what we use as a benchmark for risk, it could give you maybe 5 to 6% higher. So my view of equities is that it is about 11 to 12% asset class returns. That is what the asset class is capable of giving you. This when I'm talking about the benchmark. Now, if you are very good at asset allocation, you're a genius. In January of 2018, you removed your money from equity, you put it into bonds. In March of 2020, you removed your money from bonds and put it into equity. You can increase the return beyond the 11 to 12%, right? The second thing is that you could give your money to a mutual fund manager. It could be me, it could be some other mutual fund manager. If we are able to add alpha, you may be able to get 1 to 2% on an annualized basis better than the benchmark. And I don't think you should expect more than 2 to 3% annualized alpha over much longer time frames. There may be periods where it shows 8%, but over time, what we've seen, 3% alpha is actually also a very good outcome. So I would say look at equities as a 11 to 12% return per annum asset class. Most important thing, it will never come per annum. It is always going to be volatile. You can have 3 years of going nowhere, and then in 1 year, it will cover up for all the returns that it did not give you in the previous 3 years. So I think that is the main thing that people need to understand.
The last part that you said, that's where we face a lot of questions. That's what, I would say that's what we are paid for. Because every time, I would have put in FD, I would have gotten 6%. Now people are happy. As we speak, people are happy. But when they are happy, they won't tell us. When when the markets are down, they will. Anyway, that is the thing. And coming back, now this is a question from my side. Say like with China and USA getting on to the top of technology and companies going like $1 trillion market capitalization, 3 companies, 5 companies, whatever in USA and in China, some of those companies going up in the market cap. In India, although we manufacture one of the largest number of computer engineers in the world and we have a large consumer base for electronics, media and mobiles, etc. Our country is not up to the technology mark. I mean, I would say in general, and the number of companies that are seeded in this country comparatively are lower, or we have what is that we are lacking, what government should do from your thought process, because you might be moving with a lot of large investors, many countries and other people. So what is your thought process, what our government should do to enable this culture of technology companies, like it could be like Google or Microsoft or Alibaba or any of those things?
So this is a very tricky question, and I think it is question about which we have to introspect. We have been very good in developing the IT services business, right? So without doubt, I think India is today number one when it comes to provision of global IT services, right? So from your TCS to Infosys to everybody else. Unfortunately, in the internet domain, we have not done as well. The reason for this is that this is a very emerging domain. And if you see the attitude of governments and regulators in the US, in I would say even China, they have been okay with companies exploring regulatory gaps, exploring arbitrage in terms of setting up new business models and then seeing how those business models evolve over time. I think in India, the sense of regulations, licensing, unfortunately, is something which continues to stifle innovation, right? In India, to do anything, you first need the license. But in a business model which is still only in somebody's head, how do you get a license for a business model that doesn't exist? Correct? So that is unfortunately a very big challenge in India. The second challenge has also been that in some cases, companies have found that it is easier to access capital as a global company rather than as a local company, right? But I'll still say that it's not that we have not had any success. Remember that eventually Flipkart, which is of course today part of Walmart, is completely a homegrown company, correct? They identified how they would do e-commerce in India, and they built a fairly credible company worth $15-16 billion, which Walmart eventually paid and bought. So we are capable of innovation. We just have to be careful that we don't tie the companies up in red tape, licensing regulations. And unfortunately, when you have stories, and this is very sad, where companies have raised capital, and then instead you have the income tax department going after them, and then you have the so-called angel tax, where companies were being taxed on capital that was provided them to start businesses, then it does create a little bit of an overhang in terms of entrepreneurship. Despite these challenges, I would still say it is possible, because I think at heart we have many strong entrepreneurs locally and they are supported by talent. I think it's really a question of government understanding that in some cases, and this is actually described by Gurcharan Das, the famous author who wrote in his book that India grows at night when the government sleeps. Right? And some people say that that is the reason for success in IT services. Government did not notice and suddenly this industry mushroomed. But that is an unfair argument, because there were actually people like our former telecom secretary Vittal, who was also the CVC head, who actually played a very instrumental role in creating that enabling environment for IT services to grow. Something similar is required in the domain of IT startups. If you tie them up with licensing, red tape, angel tax, then you are stifling innovation.
Okay. So I could get it, and still more kind of investor-friendly kind of environment you have to create. That is the thing ultimately. And this is more coming to more of personal. If you are in, if you like, you can share. If not, that is fine. Where do you have put your investments? Generally, how you do an allocation? Do you invest in gold or real estate, as a lot of Tamilians do, or yourself putting in or putting in mutual funds, equity, other bonds? What is the asset allocation? Where do you invest and how do you invest? Just it will give an understanding to the people who look this video.
Sure. So I don't want to get into details, but I have never been a property investor because I somehow never liked the idea. So I own one house in which I live, and I own another sort of plot of land outside Mumbai where we actually have a farm. Outside of that, I don't invest in real estate at all. So any real estate I own is for my own use. It is not as an investment. I would never do that. Most of my money is invested in mutual funds. I actually wrote an article about this, which was published in Mint about 6 months ago, where I talked about asset allocation from my own personal perspective. When I started my career in 1994, I thought I could invest 100% of my savings in equity. Unfortunately, the 1999 2000, first the boom and then the bust was a wake-up call, because my portfolio went up 400%, then it dropped 80%. I was out of a job. My wife decided to leave her job. I had a young baby at home, and that is when I discovered asset allocation. Till that day in 2001, I did not know asset allocation. I said, okay, I'm a 100% equity guy. But after that experience, I realized that, I'm not a 100% equity guy, because I cannot tolerate this. And there are, each of us has a very different personal situation. So the only point that I would make is that there is no one single formula. You have to decide what is the right allocation for you. Till 2001, I thought 100% equity is fine for me. But that was a wake-up call. And after that, I decided, I cannot afford to have 100% there, because my job itself is so volatile. Cannot have, such a large portion of my savings invested in equity. But all my financial savings are in mutual funds. That's the predominant place in which I have. I don't have a significant direct stock portfolio, because my sort of thought process has been that when I'm managing money, I should not be trying to do my own equity investing. So, all my equity investing relates to the period when I was not in the mutual fund industry. And of course, very recently, because my company was also going public, I made the first investment in a direct equity, which must be the first investment I've made after about 14 years. Because in the last 14 years, I was in the mutual fund industry, so I never bought a direct share. But for the first time, I participated in my own company's IPO, because I thought it was the correct thing to do.
Good. As a, as a corollary to that question, one thing is they you can do many things in mutual fund. You can do debt, fixed income, you can do equity, you can do international, you can do gold, in some instances real estate. But from a normal investor perspective, they say that I am putting all my basket in mutual fund. They consider mutual fund as one asset class or one company. So they are worried that, if mutual fund blows off, what will I do? I have explained in many forums and seminars, but just a few words on that.
So, I think mutual funds are actually fantastic products, because remember that you are never investing in a fund, you are investing in a scheme. And I think the regulations that we have relating to how schemes are run actually give a fair deal of protection to investors. So that is point number one. Point number two is look at the diversity of schemes we have. I have money in liquid funds. I have money in short-term funds. I have money in long-dated gilt funds also, right? And then somewhere in between, I would also have money in corporate bond funds. So you can pick and choose each of the different pockets in which you want to invest. And each of those pockets will come with a different risk return framework, right? If you're investing in gilts, you don't have to worry about the risk of, capital, because you are basically, lending to government. Similarly, if you go to the very short term, liquidity is not a challenge. You can get your money back. It's a very liquid investment. It could be a combination of, bonds as well as short dated paper. But the point I'm making is that you can choose each of those buckets and allocate to it. Similarly, when it comes to equity, I have investments predominantly in active funds, mostly at UTI, but I do have some, old investments in equity funds in my previous firm as well. But broad point I would make, again, it is predominantly spread across diversified strategies. There are few feeder funds which invest in international markets as well that I own in the portfolio. But again, it's that same point. You can do targeted investing. So you can have a large cap fund, you can have a mid cap fund, you can have a Japan fund, you can have an emerging market fund, you can have a global income fund, but you can choose your pockets and allocate. And each of those sits in a different risk reward basket. So that is what I would eventually say. You are not investing in a fund. You are investing in individual schemes which have their own risk parameters, return parameters, and liquidity parameters. This kind of structuring you cannot get in any other investment product.
True, true. It is 100% true. For a fresh investor or who does not want a headache, say from your equity basket, from UTI equity basket, he wants a plain vanilla product kind of thing for the next 5 to 10 years. If I want to do so, is a multi-cap fund or a flexi-cap fund like UTI equity? What would you recommend? What would you recommend generally?
Sure. So, I have always had the view that if you are going to invest in only one fund and you don't want to put your money in many funds, the most appropriate category, I'll use the word appropriate rather than best, is actually the multi-cap category, which of course now SEBI has converted into the flexi-cap category in terms of the definition of how you can manage it.
Okay.
Reason I say that is that these strategies can invest in large, mid and small. And to some extent, the fund manager can determine how he wants those allocations to move. So in one fund, you get the benefit of everything, including professional oversight and a decision of how to allocate. I will just add over there that if you actually look at the SEBI template, this sort of a flexi cap allocation is possible in only two categories. One is multi-cap, which let's say now we will call it flexi cap. And the second is in the value category of funds. Because in the value category of funds as well, the fund managers have flexibility across the market cap spectrum. So to my mind, most preferred would be the new flexi cap and the value category, because there is flexibility of going across the market cap spectrum that the fund manager has.
Good, good, good. That's what, because unnecessarily we need not complicate investors who is coming with the
Exactly.
5,000 SIP, 10,000 SIP. That flexi cap, multi cap value, that is one of the best options. I agree with that. What now UTI is publicly listed, and so you will be making your plans to the shareholders more public, in annual reports and all those things. Generally, what is the fund house plan for the next 5 years, if I can say, or whatever period you may choose? And where do you see fund house growth as well as investors growth?
Sure. So I think as a company, speaking to our shareholders and what we have been telling them as part of the roadshow, etc., I think for us it's a very clear trajectory. First, we need to raise our market share, which means our incremental market share will have to be higher than where we are today. Secondly, on the back of what we believe is very strong performance, particularly on the equity side, where we have demonstrated this, not just over the last 3.5 years where we have tightened the process, but even if you see our 10-year, 15-year track records, they're extremely strong. We believe there is significant scope for us to raise market share in the equity side. And within that, our belief is that there is market share gains that we can take, particularly in the sort of top 30 cities. UTI as a brand has always been strong in the B30 areas, but we have actually lost some of our market share in the top 30. So our sort of strategic focus is to raise the market share again in those top 30 cities. The other two parameters that we think are very important to us, one is that if you look at our overall profitability ratios, we are among the top 4 companies in the industry. We would like to retain our position among those top 3 to top 5 companies in terms of our profitability ratios. The final thing I would say is that, see, UTI as a brand, it's got a 55-year heritage. It is very well known, but it is not as well known to younger and newer investors. So the other thing that we are very cognizant of is that we need to refresh the brand and the brand salience to younger people as they enter the workforce, become earning members. This is a brand which needs to again speak to them in their language. So we are looking to increase the connect of the brand with the younger people in particular, and particularly using the digital media.
Okay. And the thing is, one of the things, earlier also you mentioned it is more of asset allocation, everything. But still, investors, some of them, they are seeing the market going up, and generally they want to encash it and move to liquid funds or whatever it is, and convert themselves. And then they are saying that we will wait for market to correct before entering. Again, it is timing the market, which we are against it. But what is your thought process generally? Is it okay right now to encash or keep in liquid, etc., etc.? Or what is your thought process? That is my question.
Sure. So I would just say that at this point of time, the valuation metrics for the first time, even on things like price to book, has just gone into the expensive zone. But my own history of looking at these valuation parameters over time is that the opportunities for you to make very dramatic asset allocation shifts, which will work in your favor, actually come only once every 3, 4, 5 years. For example, there was one such opportunity in August of 2013. Maybe the next opportunity came somewhere in late 2017, early 2018. March of 2020 again was perhaps one such opportunity. Maybe January of 2008 was an opportunity to reduce. March of 2009 was an opportunity to raise. So point being that these sort of adjustments of equity allocation, the big opportunities that people talk about, they don't come every day, right? So I think people just waste too much time trying to think about when that opportunity will come. What is more important, as I said, is maintain the allocation, and within the range, you can keep adjusting it. Let's say your targeted equity allocation is 40%. If it goes to 35%, don't adjust at 39. Wait for some space. It goes to 35, rebalance. 40% target allocation goes to 45, 46%, rebalance. Don't balance at every half percent. You keep a bit of a range on both sides and rebalance at those opportunities. To my mind, that is far superior than trying to continuously adjust for valuations. You have to be very patient to do that. Unfortunately, particularly when the market becomes very, very cheap, people are more scared to act. And the reality is that cheap valuations will come with horrible news. It will scare you. And similarly, expensive valuations come with great news, right? So people have to learn how to act contrary to their underlying instinct. The instinct is to flee when the news is bad, but when the news is bad is when valuations are cheap. So if you cannot learn to do this, then better to work with a tight range around your stated asset allocation parameters.
True. Okay. Another one common question is, what people nowadays or public are feeling is big is becoming bigger. And once upon a time, mom and pop shops were wiped out. So now even smaller, medium-sized companies could be wiped out, it seems. So the company becomes either a $1 trillion company or a multiple $billion company, even in India. So some of the banks, one bank is equal to 15 or 20 other banks from a market capitalization perspective, I'm talking. So some are becoming huge. So will this crush a lot of smaller companies, smaller businesses, or many of the Indian citizens will be more of employees rather than employers going forward? How do you see that scenario panning out? These are more not exactly related to investment, but just wanted to pick your thoughts.
So, in my opinion, actually, India has had too much informalization of the economy. We have too many micro enterprises. The average enterprise in India, as per the data, employs 3 to 4 people. That is not sustainable. What we need is a very
3 to 4?
3 to 4 employees.
Employees, okay.
That is not sustainable. We cannot have such large scale micro enterprises running. What we actually need is a much healthier MSME segment, right? The firms which employ 200 people, 500 people, up to maybe 5,000, 10,000. I mean, those norms keep changing, but that is the scale at which the enterprise actually creates employment. It becomes part of the formal sector, and the whole benefits of formalization flow towards it. So I think it is a natural process if we actually see some of these micro enterprises closed down, but we need to have very supportive policies for the middle segment, the MSME. The MSME is the growth creator in terms of new enterprises and new jobs throughout the world. Even if you look at the US, or particularly in Europe, you look at the example of Germany, it is that middle-sized companies which are the growth engines of the economy. The large-sized companies, after a certain point, you'll find that their employment numbers don't move. They sort of become static. So my sense is that some of this is a natural progression whereby micro enterprises actually sort of recede, but the MSME is where we need to grow scale. Our average garment exporter or companies working in garment have like 100 employees and 500 employees. To be globally competitive, you need to have 5,000 and 10,000 employees, right? So we just have too many small enterprises, tiny enterprises, because they are trying to avoid regulations. If you make the regulations easier and allow them to scale up, it will actually be better for all of us.
Okay. And the US technology stocks and hence funds now in the last 6 months have gone up like anything. And in the last 10-15 years, I think after the dot-com bubble, things have picked up and it seems to be a never-ending story kind of thing. So where do you see an allocation for these type of funds, technology funds? It could be US or China, whatever it is, wherever these technology companies are growing leaps and bounds. So how will be there in the next 10 years, so to say, and an allocation, a percentage to those technology companies? Is it necessary?
So I would just flip that question, which is to say, when you are investing, you want to invest in the best companies. Some of those best companies may not be in India, so there is an argument for you to invest in them. And some of those best companies make products and services which are sold all around the world. So I would actually argue that as investors, we should be open to allocating money either to US or global equity centric funds which have these brand name companies which operate on a global basis. To me, whether they are technology companies or non-technology companies is not so important. So I would not focus so much on the technology companies which may be very US dominated. Rather, I would say I'm happy to buy any portfolio of global multinationals, whether they are multinationals of US origin or European origin, or for that matter, Japanese origin, it doesn't matter. But they should be leaders in whatever that they are doing, not necessarily only technology. I think one should not limit oneself to technology in that sense.
Okay. And one of the things that I have seen many times, you have a good call on sectors. Earlier when we discussed with the IT or subsequently with the pharma or automobile, some of those things. So which are the sectors do you expect in the next 3 years, I would say, next 2 to 3 years, which will do very well from now on?
So I've always said, I don't know what will do well. I only know where the sector is now providing an opportunity. Yeah. Because the valuations are giving you some degree of comfort, and equally because the growth opportunity is still visible. So when you look at it from that point of view, I still think there is a significant opportunity in financials, right? Simply because I think that's a sector where when you look at the kind of penetration that we have in terms of credit levels, etc., there is still a lot of growth runway left for that sector. And I think in financials, you will now see a degree of consolidation which is much stronger than what we saw in the previous 4 to 5 years, because the events of 2018, 19, 20 have actually led to a concentration of strong business models in the hands of a few companies. So I still think financials from that point of view are very well placed to benefit from growth in the economy. I think pharmaceuticals have also come through a very difficult time. Thankfully, this year they have done well after 4 miserable years. But I think that is still an area where we would remain quite positive. Third area, I think automobiles. It's a combination of things. Remember that for automobiles, the difficult period actually started in 2018. So they have gone through a 2-year difficult period where sales were weak. They had many headwinds. They had to make technology changes to BS6. The cost of the product in the hands of the customer went up. So all those negative things have happened. To my mind, there is still a strong growth runway opportunity available for automobiles. And I think people have, the valuations don't reflect that opportunity at this point.
Very good, very good, very good. Thank you. And in general, your advice for retail investors, ultra retail investors, what is your general advice?
So I should just add one caveat to what I said before, and this has been my own experience, particularly over the last 10 years. I think more than the sectors, what I have experienced, I would say particularly post GFC, is that picking the right stock in the sector is more important. Because even within a single sector, what we see is that the best performing stock is here, the worst performing stock is here.
True.
So to my mind, as much as we discuss sectors, the stock picking is perhaps an even more important component. So I just wanted to clarify that. Sorry, your question was about HNI?
That's where we leave it to you. I'm just asking about the sector and we leave the rest to you. Probably we may choose a pharma fund, we may choose a UTA transportation logistics fund, or financial services fund. So the rest of the job is done by people like you. Now, just I asked you, what is your general advice for retail investors?
So two things. One is you must have an asset allocation plan. Second is you must have an advisor. I'm saying this even though you are the advisor. To my mind, the role of the advisor is actually to hold the client's hand. True. You have to hold the client's hand when times are really difficult and he wants to run away. And you have to also push his hand back when times are really good and suddenly he feels he has more risk appetite than he actually has. So I think, the advisor is very, very important. And to my mind, I say this knowing that you must have your own system. The value of the advisor is in making sure that the investor stays the journey. That is the most underappreciated part of, what the advisors actually do. So asset allocation, advisor, and I would say for many of the investors, systematic investment works simply because it's a discipline. It's like waking up every day in the morning and going for a run or playing a game of whatever is your preferred game. It's a discipline. And once you do it as a discipline, it just will give you so much more emotional peace and you will sleep better at night.
True, true. And I think we are coming to a close now, Vetri. If you want to share something personal about you, your family, your children, or whatever it is, or hobbies, with that probably we can wind up.
Sure. So, I had gone to one of the MBA campuses last year, sometime early last year. And there were two questions they asked me, which I'll just share with you. So the first question they said is, how do you get started for the day? What all do you have to do so that you can be at your best when you are sort of working during the day? So I don't know what they were expecting. They thought it will be reading newspapers, reading research reports, all that. I said, no. First thing, sleep well at night. That's point number one. Point number two, wake up early and exercise. As long as I have slept well and I wake up early and I exercise, my day goes well. If either of these two don't happen, my day goes for a toss. So, that is very true even for me as a professional investor. Second thing that I would just say is, in terms of when it comes to investing, I think, people get too much into this trap of this is the best or that is the best or this is the only approach. Dogma is not a good thing. There are many approaches when it comes to investing. Choose one approach and just stick with it. It just has to be that disciplined execution. So, I think that is the sort of two messages that I would give. I look forward to waking up every day in the morning. I either do my badminton or I go for a run or I train with a kickboxing I do every day, 2 to 3 days a week. So to me, that is really what gets me going every day, and I thoroughly enjoy it.
Sounds good, Vetri. Thanks for your time and giving very clear-cut answers, and it will definitely enlighten our subscribers and investors or public in large in general. So thanks for your time, and probably next time you are in Chennai, whenever if it happens, because now your trips have reduced. So whenever you are in Chennai, let us meet up. Thank you and have a good day.
Certainly, look forward to that.
Sure. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.